So this video, I want to talk about racism from the Democrats and their media mouthpieces. I'm going to focus on two instances. The one incident surrounding the Kavanuagh hearing, and the second is Kanye's trip towards the White House yesterday. So I'm not particularly a rap aficionado, though I do like some older, like 80s style rap, Curtis Blow, things of that nature. Kanye's not bad, though. I could do a whole video on my feelings on celebrities getting involved in politics. Suffice it to say, in a nutshell, I don't think they have any particular knowledge on these subjects just because they're famous. But if you want to use your popularity to bring awareness to issues you think are important, like prison reform, global warming, hey, more power to you. You might look like a fool and might not be as smart as you think you are, because oftentimes these celebrities never have anyone to be like, what are you talking about? You know, everyone's just yes men around them all the time. But that's for another video. So this video in particular is about how people on the left often try to project things that they themselves are onto other people. So you constantly hear like the Democratic Party and their media mouthpiece talk about how racist everyone. Trump's a racist. His supporters are racist. Everyone who's a Republican's a racist, right? They say this all the time. Well, in truth, it's because they themselves are racist and have inferior views of people that aren't the same skin color as them. Now, it's not, this sort of schadenfreud's not unique to the left, right? Like, we saw the same thing when you had all these pastors coming out, or religious people coming out saying like, oh, drugs are bad and homosexuality's bad, and then like one by one you'd find out like, oh, on the weekends they're hiring male hookers and doing meth and things of that nature. Like, there's a special kind of like schadenfreude. You're like, no wonder they were raising objections, right? There's something internally going on. Well, I feel like this happens with the left a lot. So let's take the Kavanaugh hearings first, right? Then you find it strange that all over the place they were talking about how Kavanaugh was an example of the white patriarchy, or old white men were the Republicans that would be questioning, and white. It kept coming up and up, and you're thinking to yourself, well, wait a minute. His accuser, Katie Ford, all of his accusers were white, and he's a white man, so what does race have anything to do with this, right? Maybe you could understand this argument if a black woman had accused him of something, and then, you know, the argument could be spun, well, of course, a white man did this to a black woman, and so that's why people were ignoring it. But that wasn't the case at all. Everyone involved was white. So what was race being brought into it whatsoever? It didn't make sense. I'll get to it in a minute while it does. Now, with Kanye, some of the most disgusting stuff I've ever seen coming from CNN and other places where they're basically saying like, oh, this was a minstrel show. Oh, he's just the token black guy. Oh, they found the one black guy that doesn't read books because he's stupid. Oh, this is just, you know, and it's disgusting. Like, can you imagine the opposite being said? Like, if a black entertainer would have went and visited Obama, and Fox News Hannity would have been, oh, a token black guy, you know, oh, this black guy doesn't read books. It would be brutal. Like, the media would have went nuts. The Democrats would have went nuts how racist this is. But being on the left gives you cover to be a racist. And coincidentally, a lot of the people saying this on CNN are black people themselves, right? So I guess it's okay to be racist and make racist jabs at people if they're the same skin color as you. I disagree. I think that unless you're doing so in the context of comedy, there's never an excuse to like have animus to someone based on their race, regardless if they're the same race as you or not. It's the same with bigotry, right? Like, you shouldn't be going out there saying, well, just because I'm a woman, I'm allowed to degrade all women or something of that case. Like, no, or just because I'm gay, I could degrade all gay people. No, that's not the case. Again, I give a special place for comedy, because if you're going at things with a joking manner, I'm a big fan of comedy, and that's different to me. But this isn't what CNN was doing. They're degrading Kanye and using his race as part and parcel to do that. And the reason is this: it all comes down to something called cultural Marxism. Now, a lot of people watching this will understand what that is, but for those of you who don't, Marxism is like communism, right? And it's the idea that there were oppressed and oppressors, right? And in Marxism, it was people with money and then like the working class. So you had, Marx was saying, we need the working class to rise up against all these people with money. And he created this division. The problem was millions upon millions of people died. No system that's ever tried to engage in Marxism has accomplished anything. It always leads to poverty, death, destruction. And we know this. There's tons of literature on this, how millions upon millions of people died in communist China and the Soviet Union, things like that. It ends up very poorly. So basically, the people that believed Marxism had to retool it because it was obvious that it wasn't working. So they came up with this idea of cultural Marxism. Cultural Marxism is the same thing. They're still oppressed and oppressors, except it doesn't just go based on a financial incentive, right? Now they use every category imaginable to say one category is oppressed and the other categories of oppressors. So here's what I mean about it. Let's take race. You have white people who are always seen as the oppressors, and people of other colors that are considered oppressed. This is universal, right? Like, if you're white, you are privileged, you're part of a historical oppressive group, and if you're someone who's not white, of a different race, we would say minorities, like in this country, right? But it's ironic because if you look worldwide, then that's not the case, because it's not as if every country in the world has white people. It's some countries are predominantly white, some are predominantly Asian, etc. You get the point. But anyways, it's just white people oppressors, other colors are the oppressed. This is clearly, just looking at it on lines of race, you can see that this is absurd. Every race, trust me, if you go back in history, has done very noble things and has done very terrible things, right? So just pick and choose and say, well, this race is always good and this race is always bad, is absolutely absurd. And it's even more absurd to then put the traits of that race onto an individual and say, you are now responsible for everything that people that look like you have done in the past or are doing now, and so that gives you some kind of victimhood status or oppressor status. It's absolutely ridiculous, but it doesn't just stop at race, right? You could say the same thing with gender. Men are the oppressors, women are the oppressed. You could say the same thing with sexuality. Heterosexuals are the oppressors, homosexuality would be the oppressed, and it goes on and on. It gets so ridiculous. You could talk about able-bodied versus disabled. So if you're someone who doesn't have a disability, you're an oppressor. If you have a disability, you're oppressed. If you're a Christian, you're an oppressor. If you're some other religion, then you're the oppressed. And on and on and on. And so basically, you're not a person, you're just the characteristics and the groups that you fit in, right? So I wouldn't be a unique individual that has all these thoughts and feelings. I'm just a white male who happens to be straight, who happens to be able-bodied, somewhat able-bodied, I guess. No, I'm able-bodied, and things of that nature, right? And so I'm an American, right? Those are all the categories. I check all these boxes, and then I'm just a piece of paper with these boxes checked, and that's who I am, right? It doesn't matter what my feelings are. It just assumes that everyone in these categories is a certain way. So I'm supposed to be judged based on these immutable characteristics, and someone else, I would be considered an oppressor in many of my boxes that would check. Clearly, this is a terrible system, and what it's designed to do is create division to sow power, right? So it's hard to have good ideas for policies and things like that. So what people have realized that engage in this is, if we create enough division and say, if you're in this oppressed group, then you deserve something from the oppressors, and that creates this clash between, pick whatever group, men and women, white and minority statuses, Christian and non-Christian, abled and disabled, heterosexual and homosexual, right? By creating all these divisions, it allows people to achieve power because you don't realize that they don't have anything to do. They're just creating enemies for you, and then you get all amped up about your enemies, and you allow these people that are pushing this to achieve all sorts of power. So that's cultural Marxism in a nutshell. This is pushed a lot in universities and in ultra left-wing circles, right? It started in universities. Hollywood's pushing it, all of our culture's pushing it. Now you see the Democratic Party, which has been pushing racial division for years and gender division. Now this has become their chief platform. They don't have any ideas. They just want the war on women, the war on black people, the war on Hispanics, right? That's all they got. Now, just a brief aside. Remember, I don't know if you remember this, but during the conventions leading up to the 2016 election, you had the Democratic convention and the Republican convention. And when Trump gave his speech at the RNC, people were like, all these same people on the left were saying, oh, what a dark, divisive speech. His speech is so dark, and Obama's and Hillary's speech were so positive, but, Trump has this dark vision of the country by saying all this negative stuff. Yet these are the same people now saying that our country's horrible, it's racist, we need to change all these institutions, we need to take down, erase our history because the founding fathers were racist, there's a rape culture, there's a war on women, etc., etc. Now, what sounds more dark to you, right? At least Trump wasn't saying, he's saying make America great again in the sense that, this is the greatest country in the world. We need to get back, basically saying economically in our authority in the world, we need to get back to that. Now, what you hear from the left is the exact opposite. This has never been a good country. It's a terrible place. It's a place filled with oppressors that have oppressed these other people, and we ought to be ashamed for it. And all these oppressors need to give stuff up to the oppressed, right? That's the Democratic platform. And which one seems more dark to you? Anyways, So we see this with so you might be saying like, well, wait a minute, Kanye happens to be a black man, right? So why all this vitriol leveled at him? Because the most important thing about cultural Marxism and those that push it is this: all of the benefits you get from like being the oppressed status. Because and that's the other thing I wanted to talk about. By being oppressed, that's like the ultimate. Being a victim is the ultimate goal, right? That is the ultimate chip in your shoulder. I remember, like, you talk to stories, like I'd talk to my grandparents and people from around that era, and it was like, even if you were having trouble in your life with your marriage or health problems or things like that, like, you kind of kept it close to the vest. Like, your problems were your problems. I'm not saying that's necessarily the best thing, but that was what our, like, society used to be like, at least the people I've talked to, like, in older times. Now it's like the exact opposite. If something bad happens to you, you need to go out there because you want that sympathy. You want people to look at you as a victim and go, oh, poor this person. Like, they've gone through so much. Like, that gives them some kind of moral authority because they're a victim. So that's the ultimate goal of this. Like, you could achieve this high social status, the more victimhood that you could claim. So the more oppressed groups you could claim to be a part of, the more moral standing that gives you. And then, you know, you don't even have to debate people on ideas. It's just, I belong to better groups than you. I'm more of a victim than you, so you need to shut up and let me speak. This is what you see from Senator Hirono saying it's time for men to step up and shut up. And you see this all the time. We need to get there were people in the Democratic Party saying we can't have white men in positions of leadership. We need to have minority. Like, what is that about? What do you call it when you're telling someone that they have to shut up based on their race or gender? Well, that's bigotry or racism, right? Like, you would never accept this from the other side. If someone would deign to say, oh, as a black man, you need to shut up. We don't want to hear about what black men have to think. That's terrible. Everyone would right out of the gate be like, wow, that's disgusting. But if you change that around and say white men, and then you defend it by saying, well, white men are oppressors, so it's okay to attack them, it's absolutely ridiculous. No, it's not. It's still racism. And don't leave people get away with these, you know, oh, you can only be racist if you're in positions of authority, right? That's absolutely absurd. That's tinkering with and you know, I saw on an episode of Tucker the other day, they had a woman on there who was a feminist who's talking about toxic masculinity, and she's basically defining it as men that are bad. Okay, whatever. They do this interesting trick where they try to define terms so they could switch them in and out whenever they want. So, you know, you can't just say masculinity is bad because you can't say men are evil, right? So you have to be like, oh, it's toxic masculinity. There's something particular about some men that are evil. Okay, well, then why can't we just say some people are crappy? Yeah, got it. What does masculinity have to do with it? And Tucker asked her, was there toxic femininity? Because there's clearly evil and bad women, right? Even if you are sitting at home thinking like, well, not as many. Nonetheless, there's bad women. There's evil women, right? And this woman's like, no, there's no such thing as toxic femininity. It's because they need, right, they can't just come right out and say what they really think. It's we don't like men, so they have to say like, oh, no, we're not saying that. We're saying that it's just toxic masculinity you don't like. Oh, so you also don't like toxic femininity? Oh, there's no such thing as that. Do you see how absurd it gets? They constantly try to define these terms, what they're real, because they're hiding their true feelings. What they're trying to say is, we don't like men. We don't like white people. We don't like Christians, right? So they use these terms to say, no, that's not what we're saying. But instead of just saying, we don't like bad people, and there are Christians that are bad people, they won't say that. Or there are men that are bad people, or there's straight people that are bad people. They won't say that. So anyways, what you saw then with Kanye and things like that is that, I'm kind of going off on a tangent, but the most important thing to remember about all this, you lose all of that cultural benefit, that societal benefit to being a victim status if you don't toe the party line. So if you are black, let's assume, like in Kanye's case, he's a black male, right? But let's even go crazier. Let's say he's black, he's transgendered, he's Muslim, he's disabled, he's not from America, all these things that you would be like, wow, oppressed, according to the cultural Marxist. This means that, like, he's really got authority to speak, right? Like, that's what they would say. But having all of that, if he says, like, nah, I don't agree with cultural Marxism, I don't agree with all this stuff. In fact, I would consider myself, I think the conservatives have some good ideas. That is the cardinal sin. You can't do that. That trumps everything. You have to ideologically believe what they believe, or else you lose lose all benefit to that. In fact, not only do you lose all that benefit, and many times you're going after with more vitriol than just a regular old oppressor group like a white Christian male, something of that effect. If you leave their ideology, then all hands are up. So, for example, you have to be like, how many times did you hear, you can't discuss like people's looks and stuff, and women's looks and politics, and you can't be aggressive towards women. There were people saying like, oh, Trump, the way he shook Hillary's hand, it was too aggressive to do that to a woman. My feeling on it's like, who cares what her gender is, right? Like, that's irrelevant. He went up and he shook her hand. If you don't like the way he shook her hand, her being a woman has nothing to do with it, right? But not to these people. Those characteristics are all that matter, because they need to have this cultural Marxist thing. All that matters, the ideas don't matter. It's just checking those boxes that matter, right? So, he shook a woman's hand like that, therefore it's bad. He shook a black person's hand like that, therefore it's bad. No, it's either it's good or it's bad. Their characteristics don't matter, right? Like their race or gender, that shouldn't matter. And so what you see then with Kanye is he isn't towing the party line, so now he could be attacked, right? The same with, like, you can't, like I was saying, you can't attack women in politics. Sarah Palin was gone after horribly. Melania's gone after horribly, etc. Ivanka's gone after horribly, right? Which is fine. Like, you could go after people, that's fine. But you don't get to say, you could never do this to women. You could never say this about black people. We need to treat them with respect. And then, at the same time, go after the other side, people that don't agree with you, who have those same characteristics, being a woman, black, gay, etc. And use right? It's not just that you're going after them. It's that you're then using those characteristics to insult them. So, for example, the idea of like a ditzy woman or something, the left would flip out if someone on the right said that about Hillary or Hirono or Maxine Waters or anything like that. But they had no problem doing that to Palin, right? Going after black people, like, it would be ridiculous if someone on the right did that. But the left have no problem saying this about Kanye, or going after Herman Cain or Ben Carson or people of that nature, right? And it's because they realize that the biggest danger to this ideology is people from these oppressed groups saying, like, this is ridiculous. Right? Because if the oppressors say that, it doesn't matter that you use logic. Logic doesn't matter. Of course you would say that. You're an oppressor, right? Let's say you're a white woman. Well, as soon as you say that, guess what? The white part of you, of course it would say that. It's an oppressor. We don't have to listen to that. It doesn't matter what logic you have. None of that matters. Like, that's the idea. And one of the things of cultural Marxism, it engages in what's called postmodernism. Postmodernism is basically a philosophy. It's very complicated, but part of it is that truth doesn't matter. Everything's just a power game, right? So me and you discussing, it doesn't matter which one of us, if one of us has truth and logic and are using things like that. All that matters is these boxes that we check, right? Like, I'm a white man and you're not a white man, so therefore everything's a power struggle in our relationship or our communication. So the truth doesn't matter. All that matters is these boxes in this power struggle, like your race, your gender. That's the only things that matter. And so therefore it doesn't matter how much logic people say if they're from these oppressed groups. But the real danger is when people from the oppressor groups. I mean, the real danger is when people from the oppressed groups start speaking out. So Kanye is a huge danger because they know he's popular, and he's saying things like, hey, just because you're black doesn't mean you have to be Democrat. That's absolutely true, right? Like, you might be black and you're watching this and be Democrat. That's fine, right? But don't feel that you have to be Democrat because you're black, right? Like, make up your own mind. I don't feel that, like, your race shouldn't have anything to do with it, right? You should, the idea, and it's such, like, it's so racist and absurd, right, what these people are saying, because they assume that, like, all black people are monolithic, all Hispanic people are monolithic, all women are monolithic, right, and they all think the same. You would never say that about white men, though, right? You would assume, like, you'd see a white person and be like, I don't know, Republican, Democrat, wealthy, poor, right? I wonder what their feelings are. Take any issue. Healthcare, immigration, right? Tax policy, social welfare policies. I wonder what they would think about that. That's what you would think, right? But if these people would have you believe, if you see a black person, they must vote this way. They must be Democrat. They must be pro-choice. They must be, against the wall. They must be, right? And that's absurd. Just because someone's black doesn't mean that they're not as much of an individual as someone who's white. Just because someone's a woman doesn't mean they're not as much of an individual as someone who's a man, right? And everyone should know this. That's bigoted and racist to assume someone's beliefs based merely on their gender or skin color or sexual preference, etc. Right? Go down the line. It is ridiculous. It's racism. It's bigotry. But this is what people on the left are doing. And it's absolutely absurd. When will people stand up? And it's tough because it is so much of our culture, all of our cultural institutions, Hollywood, the music industry, academia, 90% of the mainstream news, right? And now we're even seeing, again, I harp on this a lot, but like you're seeing tech companies, like, so where can you go to get away from all this? Oh, online. Even tech companies are censoring conservatives. So they all come from this idea of like, oh yes, we need to focus, like this monolithic race, this cultural Marxist idea, right? I'm not saying they all specifically endorse that, but they all specifically endorse the Democratic Party and this social justice mentality that's taken over it. And so that leads to, it just seems like, yeah, it's okay to think all black people think alike, right? And anyone from outside of that world should look at that for 1 second and be like, well, wait a minute, you wouldn't assume that all white people think alike, right? Right. And so why wouldn't that be the same for black people? What's the difference? Or if you wouldn't think all men think alike, so why wouldn't that be the same for women? What's the difference, right? Which is the truth, right? I'm not a racist at all. But I feel that regardless of your, like, to me, your gender, your sexuality, your race, those are just like, to me, it's like your astrological sign to me. It's like, yeah, okay, that's not the interesting part of you. Tell me about you. And the last thing I'll say is, right, like when you hear these, one of the things that's used to kind of push this kind of cultural Marxist idea is the idea of diversity, right? Diversity is our strength. We need all this diversity. But what does diversity mean? Like, it is true that diversity is a strength. So the reason is because you don't want everyone to agree with you. You need conflicting ideas. And then when you have conflicting ideas, it does a couple things. One, it strengthens your defense of the ideas you have, and it also opens you up to new challenging things that might change your opinion. And inevitably what happens is when you have all these people disagreeing and having these discussions, diverse points of view, you end up coming up with like the best ideas for society, because the cream rises to the top, right? The problem is, the important thing is the difference in ideas, right? That's the diversity that matters. Diversity in opinion, diversity in the thoughts we have, the logic we have. That's the important thing, right? Now, you might get there from having diverse backgrounds, right? So if I'm from rural Pennsylvania and another person's from urban New York City, we have different backgrounds, so there's a good chance we'll have different ideas, right? But it's the ideas that matter. Where we're from, that's just, oh, that might lead to the different ideas. And here's why this matters. Because you have these cultural Marxists pushing the idea that diversity matters, but they just stop at the, oh, by diversity we mean different color, different races, different genders, different sexual preferences. But none of that matters, right? All that matters at the end of the day is the ideas. And constantly what we see is when they say diversity, they mean the opposite of that. They don't want diversity of ideas. They're constantly trying to censor, like, look at academia, for example. It's a big place that preaches diversity. Yet you won't find a more monolithic culture of just left-wing people. They don't want right-wing ideas. They want them censored. They want them shut up. They don't want them on campus, right? So what does it matter if we come from a different race if we all think alike? And as soon as you deign to think differently, get out. We don't want your opinions. Well, then in that case, that superficial diversity isn't a strength, right? And it's just racism. It's bigotry and racism. That's all it is. It's racism towards the hatred of the people on the oppressor groups, such as white people or men or Christians, etc. But it's also racism and a bigotry of low expectations for the oppressed groups that are like, black people need our help. We need to give them special treatment because, you know, they just need a leg up and what's been done to them is so terrible. So we need to help. No, black people are every bit as capable as white people. Women are every bit as capable as men. Now, sure, there might be differences in like what people choose to go into as individuals and such, but we should never, ever make judgments on people based on their race or gender or sexuality or things like that. It's always bad. It's always bigotry or racism. So I thought that like this Kavanaugh hearing where everything became about white male patriarchy, right? And then juxtapose that also with the Kanye situation where people were calling him all sorts of terrible names, saying he's a token black person and things things, and worse than that, like and this was on national television, right? But it's things that I'm not even comfortable saying on here right now. Like, it's truly disgusting, and we need to start rejecting these racist, cultural Marxist ideas in the left. It's just seeking to create division. If you're on the left because you believe in things like social welfare programs, heck, even if you believe in open borders and stuff, which I think's ridiculously dumb, but at least that's fine. You like the policies of people on the left, that's fine. But don't do it just because your race tells you have to be there or your gender tells you have to be there. That is absurd. All of us are unique individuals. Things like race and gender are just background characteristics. Yeah, they might help shape who we are as people, but what really matters is your individuality and your ideas. So, all right, have a good one.